Welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about, you can see it on the screen there, English constitutionalism. It's not that England is the only place that had constitutionalism. It just is kind of the one that leads to eventually American constitutionalism. It's the one we're most familiar with. So it's a good one to sort of work with. Plus, a lot of the writers write in English, so that makes it easy as well. But we're going to talk about basically all of, in a lecture, whatever you can do in a lecture, we're going to talk all of the 17th century in England. That's what we're going to do today. And what we want to talk about is this idea of constitutionalism. Now, what we're going to talk about starting next week is a thing called absolutism, which is almost the complete opposite of this. And these are two different sort of models of how government works, how people should organize themselves, how society works, that are going to be the case. And while we know today, because we live in America, that constitutionalism is sort of this thing that we like. It's sort of the precursor to democracy, and absolutism feels like the bad guy. It was not very clear at the time, which one was going to dominate and why. And even today, we still have big conversations between this. So let's get after this. Let's get going. Britain in the 17th century. We're going to start early in the 17th century. Queen Elizabeth dies. She doesn't have any kids, so the Tudor dynasty is over. And there's a new line of kings, the Stuarts, this guy from Scotland. He was sort of the next in line, combined Scotland to England, and now we start talking about something called the United Kingdom. And so the Stuarts come in. James I, right there. His big thing when he comes in, he says, look, I'm the king, and I've been told since I was a kid that I'm, God's gift to the people, and so I'm going to increase royal power, which again this is a thing that we saw happening a lot, right? The centralization of things. This is what absolutism is going to do. James I is an absolutist 100%. Let's just talk about what this means. He believed in this thing called the divine right of kings, which I know you've read about. I know you've probably heard about. It just essentially means, go read your Romans 13. God made the king. So if you question that I'm the king, if you have any problems with me, take it up with God. And essentially treason equals heresy, heresy equals treason. So if you got a problem with the king, you got a problem with God, which means you are a problem and you need to be sort of eliminated. So essentially, divine right of kings essentially says, don't even question kings. The kings are in charge. Anybody who says otherwise, it's got to go. This leads to clashes with the Puritans. Now, we haven't talked about the Puritans, though they've come up in your reading a little bit. The Puritans, it's right there in the beginning. They are the pure. They are. So all the stuff we've talked about, Protestantism and the Reformation and all that, these are the fundamentalists of that Reformation. They're like saying, go back to the Bible. I don't want to hear anything other than God. You might think divine right of kings, and yes, God puts you in as king, but honestly, God trumps you. So if God says something that we don't think that you're saying, we're listening to God, and screw you, is kind of how this goes. And you can understand how that idea of we're going to listen to, we get to interpret what God says, and we'll listen to him over you, is a little bit of a problem for the king who backs this idea of divine right of kings. The Puritans are very heavily involved in what we would call today the middle class. Like they're the wealthy people in the cities. So they were largely the members of Parliament. So the people in Parliament who, when the king needs money, the king comes to Parliament, and the Puritans in Parliament, who weren't the whole Parliament, but a lot of it, said, check in with God first. So the Puritans wanted to purify the Anglican Church with more Calvinism. If you got a problem, more Calvinism is the answer. All you need to think about with this more Calvinism is just think, again, it's not exactly right, but when we think of like the Pilgrims in the United States, the early United States, just this idea of, everything needs to be more pious, everything needs to be more, if a little bit of church is good, a lot of church is great. If a little bit of, humbleness is good, a lot of humbleness is great. If a little bit of chastity is good, then a lot of chastity is great. All that kind of stuff. James's foreign policy was not very Protestant-y. I just made up that adjective right there. James the First was making deals with the Catholics. He was making deals with all sorts of groups. And he's saying, look, I'm the king. God put me here. If I want to make a deal with Catholics, it's like God making a deal with the Catholics. So what are you going to do? And the Protestants are saying, God would not make a deal with the Catholics because they are going to hell, and that ain't cool. And so you get a lot of tension sort of building up here. But, mostly it's just tension at this point, and it's really not coming to a breaking point or anything like that. But now it will come to a breaking point with James' first kid, who's Charles. When he takes over, he kind of doubles down on all the things his dad's saying and kind of rubs it in the face of the Parliament a little bit, of the Puritans. And he just says, look, I'm the king. What are you going to do? He tried to get the Puritans to conform. Rather than just have this big debate with the Puritans over and over again, he just said, look, Puritans, you guys got to get in line, or else we're going to start doing some things against you. So he's really trying to get them to conform. Ultimately, the Parliament kept saying no to everything he was doing. So what he just did, he said, you know what? I'm just not going to call the Parliament anymore. We're just not going to have it. And for a long time, there's this long period of time, it's called the long Parliament, where essentially the Parliament met. He said, you got to go home. They went home because the king had control of the military, but they continued to say that we were a meeting Parliament. So there's this long time where it just is a mess. Essentially, he tries to rule without the Parliament. This leads to civil war in the 1640s. Ultimately, the Puritans and the Parliament win the Civil War. By 1649, Charles I is beheaded. And I really do want to point out how essentially huge this moment is to behead a king. It's not just a matter of can you behead a king, but then what? What do? Do you put another king in its place? Well, next person in line is also not very Puritan-y. So maybe we need to go with Calvin 100% and just get rid of the monarchy and have rule by the elect, rule by the Christians. So I'm going to have you watch a little something here, and then we're going to come back and see what happens next.